Wonderful. So before we continue with today's session, I'd like to do an acknowledgement of traditional lands. Royal Roads University acknowledges that the campus is located on the traditional lands of the Esquimalt and Songhees ancestors and families. It is with gratitude that we now learn and work here, where the past, present, and future of Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, faculty, and staff come together. So today's session is communication in the age of COVID. And as many of you know, the COVID pandemic has impacted all of our lives so immensely and intensely. And it's not only upended many aspects of our daily lives, but it's also shed light on different aspects of our relationships to the world and to each other, all of which unfold through communication. In this brief but very informative session, the leaders of Royal Roads University, BA in Professional Communications, we also call it the BAPC program, Dr. Chaseten Remillard and Geo Takach, and Dr. Geo Takach, they've dubbed themselves the BAPC brothers, or somebody's dubbed them. They'll have to tell us a bit about where they get that. So the BAPC brothers will walk us through some key pointers on what our communication in these turbulent times reveals about who we are and how we see the world. I'm so pleased to welcome them here today.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mara. We'll see whether we'll see how important this discussion is. You mentioned it's very important. We'll talk about communication and subjectivity, and maybe our guests can tell us how important they think it is later. Everyone, thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to join us to briefly explore a field of study and practice that we think is, yes, profoundly important, and that is communication. We'll share some ideas about what it is, what it means, and why it matters more than ever today in the age of COVID. So, what exactly is communication? Well, dictionaries tell us that to communicate is to join, unite, or make common, and that it comes from the old French word communication, related to the Latin word communis, meaning common, public, or general. One popular definition from our communication theory textbook, that's the first course in the BAPC program, is a relational process of creating and interpreting messages that elicit a response. Some communication scholars like to think of themselves as scientists, so they do what scientists do so brilliantly. They break that process of communication into parts, in this case, a handy six-pack. They say communications is sharing meaning or messages between a sender and a receiver through a medium using a common system of symbols, signs, or behavior, and within a culture. But we're here to tell you that communication actually goes much deeper than that.
Yeah, thanks, Geo. And you know, thinking about this, it sort of poses a central question, because we can define communications, but you know, why does communication matter? You know, why is it important to us? And so to me, and perhaps to Geo, I can't speak for him, but as somebody who's dedicated my career to the study of communications, I can say that there's not really an easy answer to that. You know, despite grammatical complexity, you know, of different languages, and despite cultural differences, humans develop the ability to communicate at a predictably universal rate. And that sort of points to something sort of fundamental about humans and communications. And so whether you're learning Chinese or you're learning German, you learn language at the same rate. And that's fascinating to me, because I can actually think of very little or few other examples of sociological or cultural capacities that are so universal in our collective biology. So there's something hardwired in us, you know, for communications.
The scholar of communications, John Durham Peters, tells us that we are hardwired to look at the world through our own point of view, through our own unique point of view. So he says having to engage with others, therefore, is a welcome check on human hubris and arrogance and narcissism. But Brene Brown, also a great thinker, adds that humans are also hardwired to connect with others. It's what gives purpose and meaning to our lives, and without it, there is suffering. This is one of my favorite quotes from that I've learned from Chase. But really, what better tool than communication to facilitate connection? And let's think of communication broadly here. Communication as touch, smell, taste, sight, and sound.
Yeah, I mean, and so could we, could we claim that communication is really that which transmits meaning and purpose in our lives? Admittedly, as a communication scholar, I think we could. I mean, humans use communication to build, we use it to retain, and we use it to share meaning. And if you're in one of my classes, or if you've been a student, you'll probably have heard me, say that humans are meaning-making machines. We look, and you know this to be true, we look for significance and patterns. We search for systems. We want to know ourselves. We want to know our world. We want to find out where we came from, our lineage. We want to know and share things with other people. We seek signification in facial and body movements. We intuitively communicate through smells and tastes, and touch sends messages, right? We talk to ourselves in our own head. Sometimes we talk to ourselves out loud, right? We assign meanings to silences and communications and conversations and pauses and in tones, right? And if you don't think that's the case, just think about interacting with humans that are sort of just learning the communications process. Like my 7-year-old, she'll say, "Dad, those shoes are cool." And she's learning the ability to be ironic, right? And so that tells us that all of these things, the sights and the sounds, the touches, these are not just empirically neutral things for us as humans. They carry really important signification.
Okay, but when we investigate then, do those sights and other sensations actually have any inherent meaning? As Roland Barthes would ask, brilliant French philosopher before he walked into a bus, does the signifier, what we represent, in any way have an inherent link to the signified, what we mean, the thing in itself? A simple thought experiment suggests no. Try to intuit the meaning of a word. Why would B-I-R-D mean bird? I mean, when you open the pages of a dictionary, you don't find a squished bird. We find more words. So what does that tell us? Well, thanks for asking. It tells us something really deeper. It exists beyond us. Communication isn't simply a tool for us as individual meaning-making machines, although we are that. It's something deeper that goes beyond us as individual users. I can use communication to share my individual meanings with others, but only because of something outside of me. My individual meanings, in this sense, aren't really mine at all. I've cobbled them together from a larger context, grammatical, lexical, connotational, a big bucket that already exists in the language that I am now mangling, English. Sure, I can be creative within the system, but I'm not free to create and transmit anything I choose. Why? Because our meanings are bound to the system of communication or signification that we use to share those meanings.
And I think that's where communications gets really interesting for us, is that in order for us to use communication as a form and to transmit meaning, in order for us to be successful in connecting to other people in meaningful ways, we have to already be co-opted into a present system of meaning. Like, we can't just create our own, right? You can try this. You can walk up to someone and start speaking your own personal individual language and see what level of connection and meaningful connection you foster. You probably will end up, in a place by yourself, with people asking you why you're trying to create your own language. And so herein lies the sort of rub. Communication gives us the ability to create purpose and meaning for ourselves and to share that purpose and meaning with others. But in important ways, we're limited by communication because there's an already existent system that we have to share and use to project and receive those meanings. And so if you really want to go down a rabbit hole, you can just ask the philosophical question about whether or not it's possible to have a thought outside of a system of language that enables you to recognize the thought as meaningful. But we're not philosophers, we're communicators. So that might be a little bit too metaphorical for us right now.
Or you're getting outright philosophical,
yeah,
for my taste. And that which deftly, thank you, Chase, brings us back to communication and why we believe it matters. So if we are free to create and transmit meaning to others and to connect to ourselves, that must mean we have agency over our own interpretations and how we choose to represent ourselves. If we agree with that, then we must also agree that we are only able to exercise that freedom and that agency within a shared system of meaning, one that already exists and one over which, on the whole, we have very little control. And the connection that communication enables between people, it must be shared, and to be shared, by definition, it can't be exclusive to any one person, no matter how individualist our societal orientation may seem. So this poses another interesting question. How much meaning do we have agency to create? And how much is ascribed to us by the long lineage of meanings, or let's say the knowledges or discourses that inform our system of signifying meaning, that we have to adopt to make and interpret our own purposes and meanings?
And to me, again, this is sort of the crux of what communication studies is about, because it's not easy to step out of our system of signification, outside of our system of language, and establish new meanings when we think that they should be there for ethical reasons, for example. There's a lot on the line. There's a lot of resistance to those changes. And it's just plain difficult and complicated work to change systems with the very tools and materials that are part of that system, right? So this is where we can come back to Brené Brown's quote that we are hardwired to connect with others. It's what gives us purpose and meaning in our lives, and without it is suffering. And I'll repeat that last phrase, which we sort of glossed over earlier, right? Without it, there's suffering. Without connection, without shared meaning comes suffering, is how I interpret this. And I think we can all agree, and my wife, if you ask her, would certainly recall that we've had, these conversations at the end of an exchange as one person sort of exhaustedly says, that's not what I meant. And the other person adamantly points out, but that's what you said, right? Without these shared meanings comes this suffering, right? Especially when it comes to things like, choosing wallpaper. So, what kind of suffering are we talking about? On one level, we're certainly talking about these sort of moments of misplaced meaning that can cause individual suffering between a husband and wife. But what happens when, like, the entire system ascribes meaning to me and my identity in a manner that doesn't match my own conception of myself? Chaseten, you are this or you are that, but I don't feel that I am this or that I am that.
Okay, which brings me to a point on suffering. And if you've been in a relationship long enough, you probably know exactly what suffering is. On another level, we can understand suffering as much more than just individual in nature. I mean, what happens when the system reinforces outdated, limited, or problematic meanings as to who people are and what they can do? Language is a very powerful thing. You are this or that type of person. I don't think this career / title / place is really for you, or those people don't belong here with us. They are this and we are that. They are the other. Or a nation's success is measured in terms of economic growth and only economic growth and nothing else. So how do we, as professional communicators, dislodge those meanings, and how do we negotiate those disconnections?
I mean, it reminds me of the that great 90s movie, The Matrix.
And you can't stay away from it.
I always want to bring it back to Matrix. But, how do we simultaneously rewire this historical system, in which there's maybe marginalized meanings, but but at the same time, how do we do that in a way when we're actually embedded in those systems ourselves? And so part of what we study as well in communications is what one theorist calls, the long, or a sort of a long cultural revolution, in which the revolution is sort of slowly making these changes in culture, in society, and in language to create a sort of better, good, common culture.
These are questions of meaning and ethics involved in the study of communication. Sidebar, Chase organized, I think the first of, we hope, many more conferences on communication ethics. It's a big part of what we do and woven through what we teach. We ask and address a lot of big questions, fundamental questions like, how do we reconcile notions of environmentalism when we approach those terms from differing perspectives, or define environmentalism or even nature in different ways?
We ask questions about how can we expand our language in important ways to allow identities that don't necessarily align with binary gender pronouns.
How do we renovate institutions in ways that simultaneously acknowledge and dismantle meanings that reinforce systemic prejudices based on colonialism, sexism, racism?
How do we leverage different cultural knowledges and meanings to build paths of reconciliation and better individual and community health when definitions of health and community may be different?
Here's one. How can intersections of art and technology allow us to destigmatize the meaning of mental health and expand connections among people?
How can art and cultural practice provide new models of ethical communication and facilitate connections between people?
We'll answer all of these in 30 seconds in the Q&A, or perhaps not. But these are just some of the complex questions we choose to take on in communication studies. We also look at how communication helps us understand the world and respond to its challenges. So there's a bit of meta going on here. Chase and I never meta-analysis we didn't like. He knew that was coming. Certainly the onset and the wavy omniscience of COVID-19 has permeated both the content and form of public communication in the last year plus. The need to share information and to make meaning during a pandemic reminds us of the core principles of crisis communication. Become the first source, be accurate, honest, credible, empathetic, encourage specific action, and finally show respect for the public in a crisis.
And across the globe, as casualty rates were shaped not only by the resources that public authorities had to devote to responding to the crisis, but also, importantly, how they chose to communicate it, right? We saw this early on in the success of preemptive measures in New Zealand, South Korea, and Canada's Atlantic, quote unquote bubble, to the horrible mortality rates resulting from passive aggressive and denialism in places like Brazil, Russia, initially the US. You could arguably say maybe parts of Canada as well. COVID has become a political issue. Even the act of wearing a mask during a public health emergency has raised issues of how we construct and challenge identities, attitudes, and values, and what is truth and what is not truth, and how we interpret that in ourselves, in our actions, and in others.
Yet COVID isn't the only crisis to infiltrate and permeate our public discourse these days. The unprecedented and ongoing threats to the Earth's ecosystems evidently don't stop for pandemics, and the need to communicate about these environmental threats and inspire action to counter them remains massive and urgent. For example, how we value and position, or how we frame what's happening to the climate in our communication, whether it's climate change or climate crisis or otherwise, that can have a major impact on how we act on it. The last year, in fact, saw a perceptible shift in the mass media towards addressing this particular issue as the emergency that many have long been saying that it is.
And communication factors into another immense social issue of concern around the struggle of simply getting along, particularly in the face of collective kaleidoscopes of races, cultures, nationalities, sports team preferences. For example, here at home, centuries of colonizations, ongoing attempts to erase Indigenous peoples and displace them from their traditional territories came to a head in a series of protests and blockades across Canada last year. This reminds us of the vital importance of informed, empathetic, and conscientious intercultural communication in depolarizing heated dialogue and rectifying social justices and injustices.
Another ongoing crisis is the continued poisoning of rational public dialogue. You may have noticed it. In an era in which technology can handily help to parlay fear, ignorance, or malice into mistrust and spread it like fertilizer, among other pungent analogies, conspiracy theories abound as apparently even less logical than usual efforts to explain reality. But rather than debate the premises of any one such theory, communicators, professional communicators, would do well to turn the discussion to how conspiracy theories arise and function and the damage that they can inflict.
And all of these issues remind us that even the heftiest challenges can present opportunities, or of just as great magnitude and scope, right? As any scholar or practitioner or fan of communications can tell us, a key to addressing crisis and prompting positive change is communications.
Yeah, and exactly. And the pandemic doesn't change that. If anything, in distancing us from each other and other things we love, it emphasizes the fact with a force, that fact. It emphasizes it with a force calling on each of us to bring our fullest, our most informed, and our most compassionate selves to the task of leaving the world in a better place than we found it.
And these are admittedly complex times. These are not easy topics or ideas to engage in. As teachers, as students, as practitioners of professional communication, as citizens, but the work is important. The soil is fertile, and the need is great and pressing.
Which brings us to the tail end of our talk, and a few words about the work. A few words about the work that we do here at Royal Roads.
We'll start, I guess, with the BAPC program, and I'll speak to the one that runs on campus in 1 year. Our focus in that program, and it's a similar focus to it's identical curriculum as the online. It's just delivered, or blended. It's just delivered in a different model. Is to really try to bring all of those really important questions that we've raised in this opening talk, and to marry it with what that means in contemporary practice, and to really create a situation in which your strategy and your tactics are purposeful, ethical, and conscientious. And we do that on campus in a 1 year program that you can take. During the pandemic, we've been offering that program in 1 year still, with 5 synchronous classes per week where you're online. But if you were on campus, it would be that you're having 5 classes, 5 different classes every week, and you have 4 terms that you run throughout the year. So we start in September and we finish in August, and we complete those last 2 years of your undergraduate. And I'll let Geo speak to the sort of narrative of that in terms of the course content, and then maybe mention what the difference is between that model that we offer on the on-campus versus the blended model in terms of delivery.
Okay, thanks, Chase. The 1 year on-campus intensive, I like to call the intensive because the 2 year blended program is also reasonably intensive. The difference tends to be classically the 1 year people in non-pandemic conditions come to Victoria, hunker down, and they basically devote their lives to doing 2 years in 1 year. In the blended program, it's spread across 2 years. So these folks tend to be maybe demographically, and that's very typical for Royal Roads programs with blended and on-campus. They tend to be a little bit older, a little bit further along in their careers. Perhaps they've got kids. So they're juggling their studies with the rest of their lives, as do people who come to campus for a year, of course. The BA in Professional Communications program is an applied program, meaning that people like Chase and I adore and teach theory. However, we find theory all the more sweeter when it can be applied for a practical purpose to make something better, whether it's a relationship, a work situation, an organization, a community, a province, a nation, a planet, whatever it is. And the program is founded on 3 pillars. The first one is, of course, theory. And what is theory? It's a scary word, but it's really looking at and understanding and applying different ways of thinking. It's expanding your horizons to accommodate different perspectives and different ways of attacking a problem. Problems like the ones we mentioned today, the crisis of a pandemic, environmental concerns, colonization concerns of conciliation with Indigenous peoples, and other incredibly complex and difficult and unsettling tasks can only be handled with, or we are in better shape to handle them, the more ways we know to come at them. Problems in society aren't conveniently siloed the way we in the academy conveniently silo subjects into course numbers. In real life, problems are messy and wicked, and they cut across all kinds of disciplines. So understanding that theory, but learning how to apply it in practice, in practical situations for a good use, that's the second pillar of it, is practice after the theory. And the third is creativity, because we understand that our students and our faculty and our staff are all individuals with different talents, skills, experiences that they bring to the equation in endeavoring to address these problems. And we will have courses, for example, an example of a theory course might be media and cultural studies, where you engage in some of the arguments that we took you through earlier in this talk. An example of a heavily practical course would be our practicum course, where you would be placed somewhere or take on in a consultative capacity a contract to work with an organization on a real life communications problem. An example of a course in which creativity comes to the fore is, for example, our multimedia storytelling course, in which you create a variety of media projects and understand which technologies and platforms and artistic disciplines, perhaps even, might fit a particular piece of professional communication best. Now, again, these are 3 pillars. They're not siloed. We like to think they cut across all of our courses, although some of the courses accent them more than others. We've every 5 years, every program at Royal Roads is required to do a revision. The last revision, Chase and I restructured the program to fit into 4 parts we call acts. The bureaucracy wasn't so fond of the word acts, so more conventionally one might consider them terms, although Royal Roads, we think a little differently there. We do not really have terms in the sense that most people understand it, but there's a narrative flow that takes you from more heavily perhaps theoretical orientation at the beginning, moving into the practice and the creativity. And by the time you get into your the last term, you're dealing with issues like sustainability and crisis communication in Indigenous contexts. So it's there is a method to the madness in the narrative of the program structure. So that's a a kick fanny master's program that Chase, wearing one of, I think he has the most hats of anybody on campus, will be glad to tell us about.
Yeah, and so yeah, we offer the Masters in Professional Communication as well. And the Masters of Professional Communication is a graduate degree. So it's dealing with the same types of questions as the undergrad, but the expectation is that people coming into that program will probably have some experience under their belt. They may be working in organizations already as communicators, and they want to get the credential. They could also be that they come in from creative avenues as well. We have filmmakers, photographers, graphic designers coming in to both of our programs, but at the master's level, they tend to have a larger portfolio. We have people who come directly into the master's program from undergraduate degrees. That's definitely a possibility. But most of the students that are in the master's program are, they've been doing communications, and they may not have even known that they're doing communications until they start to think about what graduate degree they want to do, and then they say, well, actually, I've been doing communications, and that's what I want to learn more about. And so we kind of take it to the next level, and we have classes in strategic communication, we have classes in policy. We have research methods classes and advanced theory classes. And there's sort of three pathways that the students can take in the master's. They can choose to do a master's thesis, where they will, they'll do quite it runs 2 years. So you're with a cohort for nearly the whole time, And if you're in different pathways, that cohort's slightly different. But so 80% of the courses that you take are with your cohort, and then you kind of come to this juncture. And if you take the thesis route, then you sort of start working with your supervisor on a project that will eventually become, your dissertation, and then you'll do an oral defense, and you'll have all of those things that come along with that academic endeavor. And if you choose the other kind of path, is the course-based path, where you can go through all of your masters and continue to take courses. So you got a lot of flexibility there to shop around, take a couple of courses outside of the master's program in communications. You could take courses from leadership or business, whatever fits into your schedule. And so there's an opportunity to kind of have a broader portfolio of classes that you've taken. That's the course-based. And then there's like a middle row where you take a few extra classes than you would if you were in your thesis, but you do a research paper, it's called, and that's sort of a, it's an extended research opportunity, but it doesn't have all of the bureaucratical sort of dressings that come along with it in terms of, having a defense and an external supervisor and so on. And so people usually take that sort of research paper if they're working in organizations and they have something that they want to really dig into in their organization, or they're passionate about, but it oftentimes is that research paper is a little bit more applied to organizational context. And I think both the BA and the MA are cohorts. It's the cohort model, which you'll find in most of the Royal Roads programs, which means that you're with the same people as you go through the program. And, and what that means is that what we found is that is a real motivator. It keeps people motivated to continue in the program because they have friends who are kind of going through it. Everyone's sort of suffering at the same time and celebrating at the same time. And so that's a really important thing to think about when you're choosing your program, because unlike other universities that are out there that may offer intensive programs or may offer blended or online learning, Royal Roads, we've been doing this for a long time. We're really good at it. Not to blow our own horn, but we're really good at it. We translate, transitioned from, when COVID hit, it wasn't a big deal because it was a big deal, but it wasn't as big of a deal as other institutions because all of our instructors had taught taught online. You know, we had the technology in place. We weren't starting from scratch. And so, you know, there's other places that are offering online instruction, but the proximity that you have at Royal Roads to your profs is unique. You know, both at the master's level and at the undergraduate level. I mean, I went to a big university that will remain nameless. You can easily find out which one I went to. But, you know, I still know my student number from that institution. And because that was literally the only thing that I was supposed to put on my papers when I submitted, right? The profs didn't want to know my name. That was just a waste of space. So, you know, I still to this day know my undergraduate student ID number. And I would actually challenge you, if you know somebody at Royal Roads, to ask them what their student number is, because I bet you none of them know what their student number is, because they all go by first name, and we all go by first name at Royal Roads. And so the students know us, and we know the students. And that's true for both the undergrad and the graduate. And what that means is that there's a really high level of support and care for students. And and that translates to an empirical measurable, which is that there's a high graduation rate. I don't know exactly what our graduation rate is, and I don't know our completion rate, but that means that people who come into the program finish with a degree. And I would suspect, though I haven't done the research, I don't want to give mistruths, but I would suspect that our completion rate is probably higher than a lot of universities that are out there, especially those that are offering online instruction. So that's something that's really important to think about when you're making a decision about where you want to go, because it's not just about what you're learning, it's about how you're learning it, in the environment that you're learning it, and who you're learning it with. And those are all really, you know, really great things about Royal Roads. I think that's about all I can think of. I'm sure there's some questions. We should leave some time for questions. Geo, do you want to complement that in any way? I mean,
I'd rather compliment it than insult it. So thank you for asking. Yes, I will compliment it before turning it over to Amara, because we do have some wonderful questions for her to moderate. Picking up on the very last point you made, the learning, teaching, and research model, or LTRM, everything here has an acronym, doesn't it, CR? Contains documents the DNA of the university, and it's what drew me to this place. When I read it, my eyes lit up, and I was delighted to see that there were actually people who thought the way I did about learning as a lifelong enterprise, learning in a cohort-based model, doing applied learning, having that affinity for social and environmental justice, having respect for Indigenous peoples. It's all in there. So if you want to get a sense of what makes the university tick, what fuels the people who work in it, and the instruction we are privileged to deliver, it's all in there. And just one last thing, I notice I have to give a shout out to our amazing BAPC program staff, one of whom who is present with us, Louise Baxfield, our program coordinator. The staff in Royal Roads is amazing in terms of relating to students, being empathetic, having the wisdom and the skill to navigate administrative structures to help them succeed.
Thank you both so much for taking the time to explore communication and culture and how it relates to us in the world right now. Jumping into question and answers, we've had a lot of questions coming in, so I will just go through them. I'll ask the questions and then I'll pass it to you to answer. So the first question is, are there any books that you'd recommend for someone who is considering MAIIC for the 2022 intake with the larger umbrella of societies, politics, cultures, and communities? I think this question applies to any books that are focusing on the larger umbrella of societies, politics, cultures, and communities beyond the MAIIC program.
Well, there was a question about the IIC. I'll jump in first, Chase, if you don't mind, because you know, we'll all have different answers to the question, which is the beauty of it in terms of when you talk about things like books. The IIC involves international and intercultural relations, so there's very much that focus. The MAPC has a more general professional communications focus, as Chase outlined, although it would cover, I would think, Chase can speak to that better than I, some of the issues that the IIC covers without focusing on them to that extent. Should have left that one for you, Chase, sorry. Sometimes we do these solos, sometimes we do them in tandem. A book I'm going to recommend to you is the one I read and got, Religion About Communication. It's by a gentleman that actually came to Royal Roads to give a guest lecture about 3 years ago, John Durham Peters, P-E-T-E-R-S. It is called Communicating into the Air. And he talks about what communication is and what it means. And if you're interested in studying it, that's a great place to start, especially chapter 1. If you only read one thing, chapter 1 of that book may give you religion or it may not for the discipline.
The book I would recommend is mine. No, I'm just kidding. That's like the classic academic response.
It is classic.
I would actually recommend a podcast by the New York Times called Down the Rabbit Hole. I think, first of all, I would read Geo's recommendation because I too think that that's a brilliant book and I think that's an important one. But the podcast Into the Rabbit Hole is a very interesting like limited series done by the New York Times on why we have conspiracy theories, why we have this polarization that's occurring in society right now. And it connects these dots between economics, social marginalization, digital communications, and politics, which if you took a course with me in the master's program called 5-4, it's got a crazy long name, but it's essentially politics, digital communication, culture, and so on. That sort of, to me, that does a really good job to kind of stitch in a really like easy way to understand. And it doesn't speak to the intercultural communications piece so much, but it definitely tells you the impact. It gives you a good sense of the impact of on how social media and digital communications is really changing the way in which we interact with each other. And I think that's a pretty big question for us right now.
And I wanted to add as well, for those who are curious about the difference between the MAPC and the BAPC and the MAIIC, like those, we actually did a session yesterday with the School of Communication and Culture school director, Zenny Lee, and he actually went through all of the programs and really outlined the difference between each of them and the similarities and the overlap. And it's a really informative session. And the good news is we recorded it too. So we're just in the middle of processing all of our recordings, but next week we'll be sending out the recording of that. So make sure you watch that if you haven't had a chance to attend yesterday. And another question we have is, do you have any tips to instill meaning and personal connection through communication in our current virtual COVID world? And I know you did cover some of this, but if you wanted to kind of summarize any personal tips that you have.
I mean, that's a great question. And I think one of the things that our program is, again, is addressing is that, for example, right now, well, in June, the on-campus folks will we'll call them on campus, but the intensive folks will be doing their practicums. And so they'll also be doing a portfolio course. So there are these two sort of hand-in-hand ending courses. Then they do that online as well. And for the practicum course, for the portfolio course, we asked them to create a portfolio based upon their work in the program and create it online in a web space of some kind, like Wix or WordPress or whatever. And then they also quote unquote apply for a job and they have an interview. And so part of what that course talks about is, well, what does that look like in the virtual world, right? So we've had to retool that course so that it will now say, what should you have as your backdrop? What should you, how do you test your mic? How close, it's media training like 101 for people in the virtual world, right? Where only people who would have been on television would need that, but we all need it now. So I think, small tips are, I think being aware of where the camera is and making connection with the camera. What a lot of people do is they watch their image, they don't watch the camera, and you can tell that they're doing that because they're looking over here while they're talking, and so you want to watch that's a simple thing, because great example of this, the Richard Nixon Kennedy debate, first televised debate. Richard Nixon was not media trained. He didn't have a high level of media literacy around television. And so he spent the entire interview talking to the actual moderator. And so this was what you got of Nixon for the entire debate. Whereas Kennedy, he was trained to look at the camera. And we know that by looking at the camera, that makes a personal connection. The eyes are, as Shakespeare said, the window to the soul. So that personal connection. And so there's this really interesting result, which is that if you listen to the debate on radio, you thought that Kennedy lost. And if you watch the debate on television, you thought Kennedy won. And so that's a perfect example of knowing the importance of platform and just having a little bit of like savviness about that new platform to make your connection a little bit better. I don't know what, I don't know.
Well, first of all, you're making me very self-conscious. I'm looking at my position in the camera. I'm kind of looking at my background. I'm like, am I too close? Am I too far? I'll connect with you later and you can help me out. But do you have anything, Geo, that you'd like to add to, and I'll repeat the question. Do you have any tips to instill meaning and personal connection through communication in our current and virtual COVID world?
Thanks for repeating it, Amara. I did a number of things as a professional communicator. Being a documentary filmmaker is one of them. So I'm all about I'm trying to help students and consistently keep learning about how to understand how different technologies work and how people may see things that they're not necessarily. They may be seeing something different than they think they're seeing, or that they are actually seeing, if that makes any sense at all. And we have a course in one of the first courses in the program is a visual communication course in which we explore all of this. And then we have the media project course, also known as multimedia storytelling. But the idea of being conscious of the fact that the world is becoming an increasingly visual place when it comes to communication, not only because there are more and more images in circulation, Insta, TikTok, blah, 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 all of the above, and not only because we interact increasingly, we get our information through mediated visuals, deep fakes, I give you. But also we're making meaning more and more through completely constructed, artificially constructed experiences. I went to a session hosted by a university, or actually an institution in a think tank of some sorts in association with a university in California. I went to this virtual thing where they were trying to replicate the student experience as much as possible in a virtual world without having them come on campus. And this was just before the pandemic, so it was kind of prescient. So it's a brilliant question that do a doctoral thesis on that. How do you communicate in a world that is increasingly becoming virtual? Because even when the pandemic ends, we ain't necessarily going to be going back completely to the ways that were before. So to me, just to button my answer in response to the question, Amara, effective communication, the opportunity to engage in that sense meaning. A purely cybernetic approach would say transmit a message, but that's, you know, old school, because you don't have communication when you just put a message out there. That's what the first communication thinkers 100 years ago were telling people. But we know it's a relational, ongoing, much more sophisticated process. Authenticity. If you can develop your authentic self as a professional communicator, that will be your best odds to make a difference and do what you want to do in the world.
Can I just add one small thing, because I saw a thing coming in. It says really important question in conjunction to children and youth, and I think as older people, there's a hesitancy to adopt new technologies and to be nostalgic, and perhaps even like falsely nostalgic about previous technologies. And, you know, it's so strange to me, because I remember growing up and everyone was worried about how much TV kids were watching, and there was like huge investigations into whether or not watching TV is going to rot kids' brains, and MTV was a problem and all this kind of stuff. And it's the same conversations that we're having now about social media. And I think that there's a hesitancy to adopt the technology, or to think that the technology is corrupting our social interactions. And I think that to a certain extent, face-to-face is it has a higher level, like it's a more rich communications platform, right? Like it transmits more meaning, right? There's smell, there's possible, there's proximity, there's all these different things that come along, which you're not getting, which as biological creatures, we probably are picking up on, right? But technology also offers things that are beneficial. We likely wouldn't have had the same level of input and interaction if this was a live event. You wouldn't necessarily have people asking questions in a live event that are introverted, because there's an inhibition that comes along with being online and being able just to type in a question in the chat. There's a simultaneousness of that interaction that occurs in a platform like Zoom that you can't ever have in a classroom without it just going into pandemonium and babble, right? Because it's just, if all the stuff that was being said in the chat was being said out loud, you couldn't hear the primary message of the person speaking. So there's a real leveling that happens as well. And online, like there's not just one transmission of information. It's not just Geo or I giving the information. There's a lot of other information that's being shared across that at the same time and simultaneously. And that's, I don't think, is necessarily a bad thing. I think it becomes problematic when you're resistant to that. And I'm thinking back to the point of kids and teaching. If there's a resistance and a nostalgia that only classroom learning can be the successful learning, then kids are going to pick up on that, and that doesn't create a healthy environment to learn. The reality is that we have to be in these virtual places, and so we should try to embrace them as much as we can and use all of the different mechanisms that are built into them and be creative with them to try to create and to try to create that authenticity, as Geo was saying, right? And I think that's really, I think that's easily overlooked because we're kind of, I don't know what it is, but we're just nostalgic for things that we don't have right now. Maybe, I don't know what a better word might be for that, but that's sort of just, and again, that's totally just my gut. That's not based on any kind of empirical research.
Thank you. And I really appreciate both of your responses. And Geo, I saw in the chat that you said Chase is right, nostalgia isn't what it used to be. And that made me laugh out loud there. So I appreciate the humor. We're coming to the end of our session today. But I also wanted to mention that it sounds like many of you have questions about the different programs. And if you're wondering about specifics, please connect with Enrollment for your questions, and they're there to support you and help you. I also wanted to mention, back in February, the School of Communication and Culture did an amazing conference on communication ethics. And I feel like many people in the room here would really enjoy the session. So I'm going to pop a link in the chat here, and it's to all of our recordings from the conference, so you can continue this conversation and dive into different topics. And thank you so much, Geo and Chase. This has been an incredible session. I've learned so much, and thank you for sharing your ideas, insights, research. It's been incredible. And thank you to everyone here in the room who tuned in live. This has been a great